In the final desperate years of World War II, as Allied armies closed in from east and west, Adolf Hitler made a promise to the German people. He spoke of retribution. He spoke of vengeance. He spoke of a weapon so advanced, so devastating, that it would force England to her knees and turn the tide of the war. That weapon was the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, a technological marvel that could reach the edge of space and rain destruction from above at supersonic speeds. But here is the terrible irony that history tried to forget. This so-called wonder weapon, this instrument of vengeance, killed more than twice as many people building it than it ever killed in combat. More Allied prisoners died in the darkness of underground factories, starving and beaten as they assembled Hitler's superweapon, than Allied soldiers and civilians died from the rockets themselves. This is the story of the V-2, a weapon so advanced it would eventually launch humanity into the space age, yet so catastrophically mismanaged, it became Nazi Germany's deadliest self-inflicted wound. It is a story of technological brilliance married to strategic stupidity, of innovation born from desperation, and of a weapon that ultimately killed more friends than enemies. The date was September 8, 1944. London had already endured 4 years of bombing. The Blitz had killed tens of thousands, turned neighbourhoods into rubble, but Londoners had learned to adapt. They knew the sound of air raid sirens. They knew the drone of bomber engines. They knew, most importantly, that if you heard the bombs falling, you were probably going to survive. What happened that September evening was different. At 6:43 in the evening, in the West London suburb of Chiswick, there was an explosion, a massive detonation that killed 3 people and injured 17 more. But there had been no air raid siren, no warning at all. And stranger still, witnesses reported hearing the explosion before they heard any sound of an approaching aircraft. That's because there was no aircraft. What had just struck London was something the world had never seen before. A ballistic missile launched from occupied Holland, travelling through the edge of space at over 3,500 miles per hour. It struck the ground before its own sound could catch up. The V-2 had arrived. Adolf Hitler was ecstatic. In his underground bunker, isolated from the realities of Germany's crumbling fronts, he saw the V-2 as proof that German engineering could still deliver miracles. He called it Vergeltungswaffe, the vengeance weapon. In propaganda broadcasts, Nazi officials promised that this technological marvel would force the Allies to surrender. The age of invulnerability was over. No defense could stop it. No warning could save you. To understand why Hitler and his inner circle believed so fervently in the V-2's potential, you need to understand just how revolutionary this weapon was. In 1944, warfare was still largely a matter of conventional bombs dropped from aircraft or fired from artillery. Missiles existed, but they were crude, short-range weapons. The V-2 was something else entirely. It stood 46 feet tall and weighed over 27,000 pounds, fully fueled. Its engine burned a mixture of liquid oxygen and alcohol, producing 56,000 pounds of thrust. It could carry a 1-ton warhead over 200 miles. But the truly revolutionary aspect was its trajectory. The V-2 didn't fly like an airplane, or even like the V-1 cruise missile that had preceded it. The V-2 went up. It climbed to an altitude of 55 miles, beyond the Earth's atmosphere, to the edge of space itself. Then it fell, accelerating under gravity, reaching speeds of up to 3,500 miles per hour. It struck before you could hear it coming because it was traveling faster than sound. No existing defense could stop it. Fighter planes couldn't reach it. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't track something moving that fast. The V-2 seemed to represent everything Hitler had promised, technological supremacy made manifest. But there was a problem. Actually, there were many problems. The V-2 was breathtakingly expensive. Each rocket cost approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks to produce. the equivalent of roughly $1 million in modern currency. In a nation whose economy was collapsing, whose cities were being bombed around the clock, whose military desperately needed tanks, aircraft, and ammunition for conventional forces, the V2 program consumed staggering resources. Each V2 launch required 30 tons of potatoes to produce the alcohol fuel. In a country where civilians were starving, where soldiers at the front were short of basic supplies, 1/3 of Germany's entire alcohol fuel production went to the V2 program. The resources that went into building 3,000 V2 rockets could have produced 24,000 fighter aircraft. Those fighters might have actually made a difference in defending German cities from Allied bombing raids. And then there was the accuracy problem, or rather the lack of accuracy. The V2's guidance system was primitive by modern standards. It used gyroscopes and simple mechanical computers to try to maintain its trajectory, but once the rocket was launched, it couldn't be controlled. It couldn't adjust its course. It couldn't hit a specific building or even a specific neighborhood. A V2 aimed at central London might land anywhere within a radius of several miles. Many landed in open countryside, killing no one. Some fell into the sea. Military strategists, even within the German High Command, could see the problem. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later wrote that he had tried to convince Hitler the V2 was a waste of resources. The Führer wouldn't listen. He was obsessed. The V2 wasn't just a weapon to him. It was a symbol. A symbol that Germany could still strike at its enemies, could still innovate, could still inspire fear. The propaganda value outweighed the military reality. But propaganda doesn't win wars. And the V2's most devastating impact wasn't on London or Antwerp or any of its intended targets. It was on the prisoners who built it. In August 1943, the British Royal Air Force conducted Operation Hydra, a massive bombing raid on the V2 research and development facility at Peenemünde on Germany's Baltic coast. The raid killed hundreds of workers and significantly damaged the facility. It also convinced the Nazi leadership that V2 production needed to move somewhere safer, somewhere the Allied bombers couldn't reach. The solution was to go underground. In the Harz Mountains of central Germany, near the town of Nordhausen, there was a complex of tunnels that had been excavated for use as a fuel storage depot. The SS identified this site as perfect for conversion into an underground rocket factory. It would be impervious to bombing. It was relatively close to existing rail lines for transporting materials and finished rockets. And most importantly, it was remote enough that the SS could do whatever they needed to do without scrutiny. What they needed to do was build the largest underground factory complex in the world. And to do that, they needed labor. Lots of labor. Labor that was expendable. The camp was called Mittelbaudora, though the factory itself was known as Mittelwerk. Between 1943 and 1945, approximately 60,000 prisoners from concentration camps across occupied Europe were sent to Dora. They came from everywhere: Jews from Poland and Hungary, political prisoners from France and Belgium, Soviet prisoners of war, resistance fighters, common criminals. Their only common trait was that in the eyes of the SS, they were subhuman and disposable. The tunnels they were forced to expand and convert into factory space ran for miles through solid rock. There were two main parallel tunnels, each over a mile long and 30 feet wide. These were connected by 46 cross tunnels. In peacetime, with proper equipment and reasonable working conditions, excavating and outfitting such a facility would have taken years. The SS wanted it done in months. The prisoners worked 18-hour shifts. They dug with hand tools and primitive pneumatic drills. The dust was constant and choking. The tunnels were damp and cold. There was no ventilation system at first, so the air was thick with rock dust and the fumes from explosives used to blast through harder sections of stone. There was no sanitation. There was barely any light. And there was no mercy. The SS guards and the civilian overseers who managed the actual production treated the prisoners not as human beings, but as tools. Tools that could be worked until they broke and then replaced. Prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion were beaten. Prisoners who worked too slowly were beaten. Prisoners suspected of sabotage, a loose bolt here, a misaligned component there, were hanged publicly inside the tunnels as warnings to others. The death rate during the initial construction phase was staggering. Prisoners died from exhaustion, from malnutrition, from disease, from industrial accidents, from beatings, from execution. During the worst months of 1943 and early 1944, the death rate reached 100 to 200 prisoners per day. Bodies were cremated in a facility built specifically for that purpose. But the SS needed skilled labor too, not just muscle. Building a V-2 rocket wasn't simple. Each rocket contained over 20,000 individual components. The assembly required precision. The rocket had to be balanced, the fuel lines had to be perfectly sealed, the guidance systems had to be calibrated. One mistake, and the rocket would explode on the launch pad or veer off course and fall on German-occupied territory. So the SS conducted selections. Engineers, electricians, metalworkers, anyone with technical skills was pulled from the mass of prisoners and assigned to assembly work. This didn't mean better treatment, it just meant different work. These prisoners spent their 18-hour shifts assembling rockets in the dim light of the tunnels, knowing that any error, any perceived act of sabotage, meant death. Werner von Braun visited Mittelwerk regularly. Von Braun was the technical director of the V-2 program, a brilliant rocket scientist who had dreamed of space travel since childhood. He personally selected skilled prisoners for critical technical roles. He walked through the tunnels and inspected the assembly process. He knew what was happening there. He saw the conditions. After the war, he would claim he had no choice, that he had to cooperate with the SS or be imprisoned himself. He would claim he focused only on the technical work and tried not to think about the human cost. But survivors remembered him. They remembered him walking through the tunnels in his clean suit while they worked in rags. They remembered him selecting prisoners for execution when quality control found defects in completed rockets. They remembered. By the time V-2 production reached full capacity in mid-1944, the factory had settled into a horrifying routine. Prisoners worked, starved, died, and were replaced by new prisoners from other camps. The rockets rolled out of the tunnels, were loaded onto specially designed rail cars, and were shipped to launch sites in Holland and Germany. And the death toll inside the mountain continued to climb. The precise number of deaths at Mittelbau-Dora will never be known with certainty. The SS destroyed many records as Allied armies approached in 1945. But historians have established a reliable estimate through survivor testimony, recovered documents, and forensic evidence. Of the approximately 60,000 prisoners sent to Dora between 1943 and 1945, between 20,000 and 25,000 died there, roughly 1 in 3. And at least 10,000 of those deaths were directly attributable to V-2 production, from the excavation work, from the assembly process, from the executions and beatings and disease that the production regime created. 10,000 people died building the V-2. That number needs to be remembered because it's about to become very important. On September 8, 1944, as Londoners were discovering that a new kind of weapon had struck their city, the V-2 campaign began in earnest. Over the next 7 months, until the last V-2 was launched on March 27, 1945, the Nazis fired approximately 3,000 V-2 rockets at Allied targets. About half of those rockets worked properly. The other half exploded on launch, broke apart in flight, or veered wildly off course due to guidance failures. The primary targets were London and Antwerp. London, because it was the British capital, and striking it had propaganda value. Antwerp, because it was the primary port through which the Allies were supplying their armies advancing into Germany, and hitting it had actual strategic value. In London, over the course of the 7-month campaign, approximately 1,300 V-2s reached the city. They killed around 2,700 people and injured about 6,000 more. In Antwerp and the surrounding area, About 1,600 V-2s landed, killing approximately 6,500 people, mostly Belgian civilians and Allied soldiers working at the port facilities. There were some horrific individual strikes. On November 25, 1944, a V-2 struck a Woolworths department store in London, killing 168 people. On December 16, 1944, a V-2 struck a crowded cinema in Antwerp, killing 567 people in what remains the deadliest single V-2 attack of the war. But overall, the casualty figures tell a clear story. The V-2 killed approximately 9,000 Allied military and civilians in combat. That's 9,000 deaths from 3,000 launches, at a cost of over 300 million Reichsmarks and a staggering investment of Germany's dwindling industrial capacity. And in the tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora, at least 10,000 people died building those rockets. More Germans and Allied prisoners died making the V-2 than Allied troops and civilians died from the V-2 attacks. The arithmetic is stark and undeniable. Hitler's vengeance weapon killed more of its makers than its targets. It was a net loss in every measurable category, economically, strategically, morally. So why didn't they stop? Why did production continue until literally the final weeks of the war, when Germany was clearly defeated, when there was no possible hope that the V-2 could change the outcome? The answer lies in the psychology of totalitarian regimes and the specific madness of Nazi Germany in its death throes. By late 1944, rational military calculation had ceased to guide German strategy. Hitler was increasingly detached from reality, convinced that willpower and wonder weapons could somehow reverse Germany's fortunes. He had become obsessed with the idea of vengeance, with striking back at the enemies who had bombed German cities. The V-2 served a psychological function more than a military one. It allowed Hitler and his propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels to tell the German people that Germany was still on the offensive, still innovating, still capable of striking fear into the enemy. The fact that the weapon was militarily ineffective didn't matter. The propaganda value, the maintenance of morale through delusion, took precedence. There was also bureaucratic momentum. Thousands of people were employed in the V-2 program, not just the prisoners at Dora, but engineers, technicians, logistics personnel, SS guards. Shutting down the program would have meant acknowledging failure and redeploying those resources elsewhere. And in the Byzantine politics of the Nazi state, no one wanted to be the person who told Hitler his pet project was a waste. So the rockets kept launching, and the prisoners kept dying. Until March 27, 1945, when the last operational V-2 was fired at London. It killed one person. 6 weeks later, Germany surrendered. But the story of the V-2 didn't end with Germany's defeat. In many ways, the most disturbing chapter was just beginning. As Allied armies advanced into Germany in the spring of 1945, they weren't just looking to capture territory. They were racing to capture knowledge. Both the Americans and the Soviets had realized that German rocket technology was years ahead of anything they had developed. The V-2 represented a quantum leap in ballistic missile capability. And in the emerging Cold War, both superpowers wanted that technology for themselves. In April 1945, American forces reached the Harz Mountains and discovered Mittelbau-Dora. They found the tunnels, the crematorium, the piles of bodies. They also found approximately 100 intact V-2 rockets and, more importantly, vast caches of technical documents and component parts. The Americans immediately began a systematic looting operation, packing everything onto trains and shipping it back to the United States before the Soviets, whose occupation zone included Nordhausen, could claim it. But hardware and documents weren't enough. The Americans wanted the people who had designed and built the V-2. They wanted the engineers who understood the technology intimately, who could not only replicate it, but improve upon it. This desire led to Operation Paperclip, one of the most morally controversial programs in American history. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, The United States government secretly recruited over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians and brought them to America. Many had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had been SS officers. Their backgrounds were quietly sanitized in official records, their Nazi affiliations downplayed or erased. The justification was simple, brutal pragmatism. If we don't take them, the Soviets will. In the emerging Cold War, technological superiority was everything. Nuclear weapons, jet aircraft, ballistic missiles. These would determine the balance of power. Whatever moral qualms anyone might have had about employing former Nazis were swept aside by Cold War necessity. And at the center of Operation Paperclip was Wernher von Braun. Von Braun surrendered to American forces in May 1945, along with more than 100 of his top engineers. He had organized their surrender carefully, making sure they fell into American rather than Soviet hands. He understood that his knowledge made him valuable, that his expertise could buy him a new life. The Americans were delighted to have him. They shipped von Braun and his team to Fort Bliss, Texas, and then to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. There, using captured V-2 components, von Braun's team began teaching American engineers how to build and launch ballistic missiles. The first launches were essentially just firing captured V-2s, but gradually American engineers absorbed the technology and began developing their own rockets. Von Braun was brilliant, charismatic, and ambitious. He spoke excellent English. He was handsome and articulate. He quickly understood that to succeed in America, he needed to make himself indispensable and publicly acceptable. In the 1950s, von Braun became a media figure. He appeared on Walt Disney television specials, explaining rocket science and space travel to millions of American children. He wrote popular articles about the future of space exploration. He became the face of America's nascent space program, the genius German scientist who had come to America and was now working to fulfill humanity's destiny among the stars. In 1960, von Braun was transferred to NASA and became the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. There, he led the development of the Saturn V rocket, the massive launch vehicle that would carry the Apollo missions to the moon. It was the culmination of everything he had worked toward since his days as a young engineer in Germany. A rocket powerful enough to escape Earth's gravity and send humans to another world. On July 16, 1969, Wernher von Braun stood in the firing room at Kennedy Space Center and watched as Apollo 11 launched atop his Saturn V. 3 days later, he watched as Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. It was von Braun's triumph. The rocket scientist who had dreamed of space travel since childhood had built the machine that carried humans to the moon. The American press celebrated him. President Nixon praised him. He received the National Medal of Science. He became, in the public imagination, the very embodiment of American technological prowess and the space-age dream. What was rarely mentioned, what was carefully omitted from his official biographies, was Mittelbau Dora. The tunnels, the tens of thousands of prisoners, the bodies, his visits to the underground factory, his role in selecting prisoners for technical work, his knowledge of what was happening there. When asked about it, von Braun said he had focused on the technical work and tried not to think about the moral implications. He said he had been caught in circumstances beyond his control. He said that everyone was complicit in war, that these were impossible choices, that the important thing was what you did afterward. He never publicly expressed remorse for the deaths at Mittelbau Dora. He never acknowledged his own complicity. He lived until 1977, celebrated and honored, the man who took us to the moon. The historical record is more complicated than von Braun's defenders or his critics would like to admit. He was a member of the SS, though he later claimed the membership was forced upon him and was merely honorary. He visited Mittelbau Dora multiple times and witnessed the conditions there firsthand. Former prisoners testified after the war that he was aware of the brutality and participated in selection processes that determined who lived and who died. But he was never prosecuted. He was too valuable. The United States needed his knowledge more than it needed justice for the dead prisoners of Dora. That was the calculation, cold and clear. The space race took precedence over war crimes trials. This raises questions that have no easy answers. Can technological achievement be separated from moral culpability? Does the end, landing on the moon, advancing human knowledge, winning the Cold War, justify the means of employing men who were complicit in atrocities? What does it mean that the same technology that killed thousands in slave labor camps became the foundation for space exploration? These are not rhetorical questions. They're urgent moral problems that extend far beyond World War II and the V2 program. Every generation faces them in new forms. How do we weigh innovation against human cost? When does pragmatism become complicity? At what point does the pursuit of strategic advantage compromise our moral foundation? The V2's story doesn't offer clean answers. It offers instead a mirror, and the reflection is uncomfortable. Consider the full arc of this weapon's existence. It began as Hitler's promised instrument of vengeance, a superweapon that would force the Allies to their knees and turn the tide of the war. It consumed staggering resources that might have genuinely altered Germany's defensive capabilities if applied to conventional weapons. It killed thousands of people, but most of those deaths came in the factories, not on the battlefields. It failed strategically. Military historians generally agree that the V2 program was one of Nazi Germany's most catastrophic miscalculations. The same resources devoted to building 3,000 rockets could have produced 24,000 fighter aircraft. Those fighters, used to defend German cities from Allied bombing raids and to contest Allied air supremacy over the invasion beaches, might have made a significant difference. They wouldn't have won the war for Germany. By 1944, Germany's strategic position was hopeless. But they might have prolonged the war, increased Allied casualties, and delayed victory. Instead, Hitler poured resources into a weapon that was technically impressive but strategically worthless. A weapon that couldn't be aimed accurately enough to hit specific targets, that couldn't carry a large enough warhead to cause devastating damage, that couldn't be produced in numbers sufficient to overwhelm Allied defenses, even if those defenses had existed. And the human cost. 10,000 people at minimum died building the V2. 9,000 people died from V2 attacks. The weapon killed more of its makers than its enemies. That fact alone makes the V2 perhaps the most perverse weapon in military history, a weapon that, in cold arithmetic terms, would have done less damage to the enemy if it had never been built at all. Yet, the V2 did accomplish something Hitler never intended. It launched the space age. The technology pioneered in the tunnels of Mittelbau Dora, perfected through trial and error by prisoners working in darkness, became the foundation for every ballistic missile and space rocket that followed. The American Redstone, the Soviet R-7, the French Diamant, all descended directly from the V2. And ultimately, the Saturn V that carried Apollo to the moon was the great-grandchild of Hitler's vengeance weapon. The same rocket that rained terror on London and Antwerp, built by slave labor in conditions that killed thousands, eventually became humanity's vehicle for exploring beyond Earth. The astronauts who walked on the moon were riding, in essence, an evolved V2. They were benefiting from knowledge purchased with prisoner blood in German tunnels. That is the final, bitter irony. Hitler's weapon of vengeance became humanity's means of transcendence. The rocket built by slaves in darkness reached the moon in the hands of free men in the light. How are we supposed to feel about that? There's no single answer, no convenient moral to extract. The V2's story resists simplification. It contains multitudes of contradictions. It was a technological marvel and a strategic disaster. It was a weapon of war that killed more of its makers than its targets. It was built through horrific cruelty, and yet opened the door to achievements that inspire wonder. It was the work of brilliant engineers who were also complicit in atrocities. It failed to change the outcome of World War II, but fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Cold War and the space race. Perhaps the most important lesson is about the nature of innovation in wartime. War has always driven technological advancement. The production Bible traces this arc from ancient bronze weapons through medieval gunpowder to modern precision-guided munitions. War creates urgency, concentrates resources, and removes peacetime constraints on what can be attempted. Some of humanity's greatest technological leaps have occurred under the pressure of military competition. But the V2 reminds us that innovation without strategic wisdom leads to catastrophic waste. Germany in 1944 needed tanks and fighters and fuel and ammunition for conventional forces. It didn't need an experimental ballistic missile that consumed vast resources for minimal military return. The decision to pursue the V2 program as aggressively as Germany did was driven more by Hitler's emotional need for vengeance and propaganda than by sound military judgment. This pattern recurs throughout history. Nations in crisis often turn to wonder weapons, to technological silver bullets that promise to reverse failing fortunes. Usually, these promises prove hollow. Resources that could have been applied to proven, effective systems are instead poured into experimental programs that fail to deliver decisive results. The V2 also demonstrates that technological sophistication doesn't guarantee strategic success. The rocket itself was a genuine achievement, decades ahead of anything the Allies had developed. But technology exists within a strategic context. A brilliant weapon badly employed is worse than a simple weapon used effectively. The V2 was aimed at targets where its impact would be primarily psychological rather than militarily decisive. And by 1944, German morale was so damaged that even psychological victories couldn't meaningfully prolong the war. There's another lesson about human cost. All warfare involves moral compromise. All military operations result in deaths, including innocent deaths. But the V2 program represents an extreme case, a weapon that killed more through its production than its deployment. The prisoners who died at Mittelbau Dora didn't die in combat. They didn't die from military necessity. They died because the Nazi regime treated human life as just another expendable resource, something to be consumed and discarded in pursuit of Hitler's delusions. And then there's the question of memory and accountability. Von Braun's transformation from SS officer to American hero reflects a broader pattern of selective amnesia. We celebrate achievement while compartmentalizing atrocity. We focus on the moon landing and forget the tunnels. We honor the engineer and forget the prisoners. This isn't unique to von Braun or Operation Paperclip. It's a persistent human tendency. We want clean narratives, heroes and villains, good and evil, triumph and tragedy. Real history is messier. Real history contains people like von Braun, who were simultaneously brilliant innovators and complicit in crimes, who did achieve remarkable things, but whose achievements were built on suffering they chose to ignore or minimize. What should we do with such figures? Should we refuse to acknowledge their achievements because of their complicity? Should we celebrate their achievements while ignoring their pasts? Or should we do the harder work of holding both truths simultaneously, acknowledging that the same person can be brilliant and morally compromised, that technological achievement doesn't erase ethical failure, that we can admire what they accomplished while condemning how they accomplished it? The V2's story forces us to confront these questions. There's no way to tell the story honestly without engaging with its moral complexity. The rocket that took us to space was designed by a man who oversaw slave labor. The technology that enabled satellite communications and GPS and weather monitoring and countless other modern conveniences descended from a weapon that killed thousands of prisoners in its production. We can't undo that history. We can't separate the achievement from its origins. What we can do is remember the full story. We can refuse to let the wonder of the achievement erase the horror of its origins. We can honor the dead of Mittelbau-Dora by telling their story alongside von Braun's. We can insist that progress built on suffering be acknowledged as such. In the end, the V2 stands as a monument to human contradiction. We are capable of extraordinary innovation and extraordinary cruelty, sometimes in service of the same goal. We can reach for the stars while grinding other humans into the dirt. We can dream of transcendence while perpetrating atrocities. The V2 killed approximately 9,000 Allied military personnel and civilians in combat. It killed at least 12,000 people in its production, most of them prisoners at Mittelbau-Dora. Hitler's wonder weapon was most effective at killing the very people forced to build it. It didn't win the war, it didn't turn the tide, it didn't force the Allies to surrender. It consumed vast resources for minimal military return. It stands as perhaps the most catastrophic weapon program in modern military history. A technical achievement married to strategic incompetence, a marvel of engineering that became an instrument of atrocity. Yet that same weapon, that same technology, eventually carried humans to the moon and opened the age of space exploration. The V2's descendants now orbit Earth, studying our planet and the cosmos, enabling communication and navigation, expanding human knowledge. The rocket built in darkness by dying prisoners now serves humanity's highest aspirations. That transformation doesn't redeem the V2's origins. It doesn't excuse the deaths at Mittelbau-Dora or absolve von Braun and his colleagues of complicity. But it does remind us that technology itself is morally neutral. A rocket is just a machine. It can carry a warhead or a satellite. It can destroy a city or photograph a distant galaxy. What matters is human choice, human judgment, human morality in deciding how to use our tools. The V2 killed more of its makers than its enemies. That will always be its primary historical legacy. A weapon so badly conceived and executed that it inflicted greater damage on those who built it than on those it targeted. It's a cautionary tale about desperation, delusion, and the catastrophic cost of pursuing technological supremacy without strategic wisdom or moral constraint. But the V2's secondary legacy, its transformation from weapon to tool of exploration, suggests that even the darkest origins don't permanently taint technology's potential. We can choose to use our innovations for better purposes than those for which they were created. We can learn from past atrocities rather than repeat them. We can remember the prisoners who died in the tunnels, even as we celebrate the achievements their forced labor made possible. That's not redemption. It's acknowledgement. It's the hard work of holding complex truths simultaneously, of refusing easy narratives in favor of honest reckoning. The V2 was a wonder weapon that failed to work wonders. It was a vengeance weapon that took vengeance primarily on those who built it. It was a technological triumph that demonstrated how innovation without morality leads to catastrophe. And it was, ultimately, the foundation for achievements that transcended its origins, proof that what we build in darkness can eventually serve the light, if we choose to make it so. History rarely offers clean moral lessons. The V2's story is messy, complicated, uncomfortable. It resists the narratives we prefer. But perhaps that discomfort is the point. Perhaps the value of remembering the V2 isn't in extracting some tidy conclusion about technology, or war, or human nature. Perhaps the value is in the remembering itself, in refusing to forget the prisoners who died building a weapon that didn't work, in acknowledging the moral compromises that enabled the space age, in recognizing that progress and atrocity can emerge from the same source. The V2 killed more Germans than Allies. Hitler's promise of retribution became self-inflicted punishment. The wonder weapon was, in the final analysis, a wonder of failure and irony, a cautionary tale dressed as a technical achievement, a warning masquerading as progress. That warning still echoes. Every time we develop new weapons, new technologies, new means of destruction, we face the same questions the V2 forces us to confront. What are we willing to sacrifice in pursuit of military advantage? How do we weigh human cost against strategic benefit? When does innovation become atrocity? At what point does the promise of technological supremacy blind us to moral and strategic reality? These questions don't have permanent answers. Each generation must answer them anew, in different contexts, facing different choices. But the V2's story provides a reference point, a historical example of what happens when we answer wrongly, when we pursue technological marvels without strategic wisdom, when we treat human life as expendable, when we convince ourselves that sufficiently advanced weapons can compensate for failing strategy and bankrupt morality. The V2 was supposed to win the war. Instead, it stands as testimony to how technological brilliance without moral foundation and strategic clarity leads not to victory, but to catastrophic failure, and to suffering borne primarily by those who had no stake in the outcome and no choice in their